Chicago, Illinois, 1998. The day jealousy destroyed everything. Most people think jealousy begins with anger, but psychologists have discovered something surprising. Jealousy rarely begins with anger. It usually begins with fear. The fear of losing someone, the fear of being replaced, the fear that one day the person who once chose you might choose someone else. And sometimes that fear becomes so powerful that it starts changing the way we see reality itself. This is the story of Jessica Miller, a woman who appeared to have everything: a successful career, a loving relationship, a stable future. And yet, beneath the surface, there was a fear she had spent most of her life trying to escape. In 1998, Jessica was 32 years old. She worked as an elementary school teacher on the northwest side of Chicago. Students loved her, parents trusted her, coworkers described her as thoughtful, patient, and kind. She remembered birthdays, stayed late to help struggling students, volunteered for school events. From the outside, she looked like someone who had her life completely together. And perhaps that's why nobody noticed what was happening inside her mind. Because suffering is often invisible, especially when someone becomes very good at hiding it. Jessica lived with her fiancé, Ryan Miller. Ryan was an architect, quiet, reliable, hardworking, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Together, they looked like the perfect couple. They had been together for nearly 6 years. They talked about marriage, about children, about buying a larger home one day. Friends admired them. Family members admired them. Even strangers who met them briefly often described them as happy. And for a long time, they genuinely were. But there is something important about fear. Fear doesn't disappear simply because life improves. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, hidden beneath years of success and stability, until something awakens it. To understand Jessica, we need to go back much further, back to when she was 10 years old. One ordinary afternoon, her father left. No dramatic argument, no long explanation, no emotional goodbye. One day, he was there. The next day, he wasn't. Children often experience events differently than adults. Adults see circumstances. Children see meaning. And somewhere in Jessica's young mind, a belief quietly formed. People leave, even the people who promise they won't. Years passed. Jessica grew older. She built a career, created friendships, fell in love. But that belief never completely disappeared. Psychologists sometimes call this an abandonment wound, a deep emotional fear created by early experiences of loss. Many people carry these fears without realizing it. Most learn how to manage them. Some learn how to hide them. And some become so successful at hiding them that even they forget the fear is still there until something triggers it. For Jessica, that trigger arrived in early 1998. At first, it seemed insignificant. Ryan became busier at work. A major architectural project had recently been approved. The project demanded longer hours, more meetings, more deadlines, more responsibilities. He began arriving home later than usual. Sometimes he answered work calls during dinner. Sometimes he canceled plans. Sometimes he seemed distracted. None of these things were unusual. In fact, most people would have considered them completely normal. But fear rarely asks what is normal. Fear asks a different question. What if? What if something has changed? What if he's pulling away? What if you're about to lose him? At first, Jessica ignored those thoughts. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself everything was fine. She told herself Ryan had never given her a reason to doubt him. And she was right. But fear doesn't always care about facts. Sometimes, fear only cares about possibility. And over the next few weeks, those possibilities would begin to grow, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until they became impossible to ignore. And that is where this story truly begins. The human brain is constantly trying to answer questions. Most of the time, it does an incredible job. But sometimes, when there isn't enough information, the brain begins creating its own answers. And those answers are often shaped by emotion rather than reality. For Jessica Miller, that process had already begun. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. Ryan came home a little later. A meeting lasted longer than expected. A phone call interrupted dinner. Small things, ordinary things, the kinds of events that happen in millions of relationships every day. Yet something was different. Jessica was no longer seeing those events through trust. She was seeing them through fear. And fear changes everything. A delayed response becomes a warning sign. A canceled plan becomes a rejection. A distracted conversation becomes evidence. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as threat perception. When a person becomes emotionally anxious, the brain starts scanning the environment for danger. The problem is, the brain doesn't always distinguish between real danger and imagined danger. To the anxious mind, both can feel equally real. One Thursday evening, Ryan arrived home nearly an hour later than usual. He looked exhausted, dropped his keys on the counter, apologized for being late, and immediately began talking about a project deadline. Jessica smiled. She listened. She nodded. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. To Ryan, it was just another evening. But later that night, Jessica replayed every second of it. Lying awake in bed, she mentally reviewed the conversation again and again. Had he sounded different? Did he avoid eye contact? Why had he looked at his phone during dinner? The strange thing was, she didn't have any answers, only questions. And questions have a tendency to multiply, especially when fear is involved. The next morning, she promised herself she would stop overthinking. After all, Ryan had never lied to her, never betrayed her, never given her a reason to doubt him. For 6 years, he had been exactly the same person. Dependable, loyal, consistent. But fear rarely listens to logic. Fear listens to possibility. And possibility was becoming louder. A few days later, Ryan canceled their Friday dinner plans. A client meeting had been moved unexpectedly. The explanation made sense. It was reasonable. It was believable. But Jessica barely heard it, because another story had already started forming inside her mind. What if work wasn't the real reason? What if he simply didn't want to spend time with her? What if something had changed? This is one of the most fascinating things about human psychology. Once a fear takes root, the brain often begins collecting information to support it. Not because we want to suffer, but because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Even painful certainty. Jessica wasn't looking for evidence anymore. She was looking for reassurance. And the more reassurance she needed, the less effective reassurance became. Soon she found herself paying attention to details she had ignored for years. How often Ryan checked his phone. How often he mentioned work. How often he seemed tired. How often he smiled at a message. Each detail felt important. Each detail felt connected. Yet none of them actually proved anything. That didn't matter, because the story was growing. One afternoon, while grading papers at school, Jessica realized she had spent nearly 20 minutes thinking about Ryan. Not because anything had happened, because nothing had happened. Her mind was filling empty space with possibilities. And possibilities were slowly becoming assumptions. Then, one evening, a name entered the story. A simple name. A completely ordinary name. Emily. Ryan mentioned her casually while discussing work. A project coordinator. A co-worker. Nothing more. The entire conversation lasted less than 15 seconds. Ryan moved on, but Jessica didn't. For some reason, the name stayed with her. Emily. The next day, she remembered it again. Emily. A few days later, she remembered it again. Not because the name meant anything, but because fear had attached itself to it without realizing it. Jessica had begun searching for evidence to support a conclusion she hadn't fully admitted to herself. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop, because sometimes the most dangerous stories are not the ones we hear from other people. They're the ones we quietly tell ourselves. The human brain is remarkably efficient. Every second, it processes thousands of pieces of information: faces, voices, movements, sounds, details. Most of those details are ignored. Because if we noticed everything, we would become overwhelmed. So the brain makes a decision. It filters. It chooses what deserves attention. And that process is usually helpful, unless fear becomes involved. Because once fear enters the equation, the filter changes. Suddenly, the brain begins paying attention to things it previously ignored, not because those things are important, but because they appear connected to the fear. Psychologists call this selective attention, and Jessica Miller was experiencing it without realizing it. By now, Emily had become more than just a name. She had become a symbol, a possibility, a question mark that followed Jessica everywhere. The strange thing was, Ryan wasn't talking about Emily very often. In fact, he barely mentioned her at all. But Jessica noticed every single time he did. A brief comment during dinner, a passing reference to a meeting, a casual mention of a project deadline. Most people would have forgotten those moments within seconds. Jessica remembered every one of them, not because they were important, because fear had labeled them important. And once fear labels something important, the brain treats it differently. Soon, Jessica found herself replaying conversations again and again and again, looking for hidden meaning, looking for clues, looking for something she couldn't even define. One afternoon, while sitting in the teacher's lounge, she suddenly remembered a conversation from 2 weeks earlier. Ryan had smiled while talking about a project. At the time, she hadn't thought anything of it. Now, she wondered, was Emily there? The question appeared instantly, without effort, without evidence. And that's what made it dangerous. Because assumptions often arrive disguised as observations, the brain quietly turns. I wonder if, into, it probably happened. And eventually, it must have happened. The story inside Jessica's mind was becoming more detailed, more convincing, more emotionally real. Every day added new pieces, most of them imagined, yet all of them felt significant. This is where confirmation bias often begins. Confirmation bias is the tendency to notice information that supports our beliefs, while ignoring information that challenges them. And once it takes hold, it can become incredibly powerful. Ryan still came home every night. Ryan still called her during the day. Ryan still talked about their future. Ryan still treated her with kindness. But Jessica noticed those things less and less. Instead, she noticed the moments that supported her fear. A delayed response, a busy schedule, a canceled plan, a mention of Emily. The evidence was incomplete, but the story felt complete. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan left for another project meeting. Jessica watched him drive away. Then she remained standing by the window. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. 15 minutes passed. She was still there. Not because she expected something to happen, because she couldn't stop thinking about what might happen. That difference is important. She wasn't reacting to reality anymore. She was reacting to possibilities. And possibilities can be endless. The more she thought, the more questions appeared. The more questions appeared, the more anxious she became. And the more anxious she became, the more she searched for answers. The cycle fed itself, quietly, relentlessly, without anyone noticing, including Jessica herself. By the end of that month, she was spending more time inside the story than inside reality. And that is often the moment when obsession begins. Not when a person discovers something, but when they become unable to stop searching. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever worried about something so much That your mind started creating stories before you had any proof? Let me know in the comments. Because Jessica was about to make a decision that would change everything. The moment obsession becomes dangerous is usually invisible. There is no alarm, no dramatic turning point, no obvious warning sign. Most people imagine that losing control happens suddenly, but in reality, it often happens one small decision at a time. For Jessica Miller, that process had already begun. At first, she still believed she was being reasonable, careful, responsible. She told herself she was simply paying attention, simply protecting her relationship, simply trying to understand what was happening. But there was one problem. She wasn't searching for the truth anymore. She was searching for relief. And those are very different things. One evening, Ryan left his phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. The device sat there quietly, motionless, ordinary. Yet Jessica couldn't stop looking at it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a minute passed. Then another. Her eyes kept returning to the phone. Not because she wanted information, because she wanted certainty. And certainty can become addictive, especially for anxious minds. Psychologists sometimes compare reassurance to a temporary painkiller. It works, but only for a short time. Then, the discomfort returns, often stronger than before. Jessica knew checking Ryan's phone would be wrong. She knew trust required uncertainty. She knew healthy relationships depended on boundaries. Yet another voice inside her mind whispered something different. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. The thought felt logical, reasonable, even justified. And that's what made it dangerous. Because the most destructive choices rarely arrive wearing the label bad decision. They arrive disguised as solutions. Jessica picked up the phone. Her heart immediately started racing. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands felt cold. Part of her expected to find something. Part of her hoped she wouldn't. The screen lit up. Messages, emails, work updates, project schedules. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that supported the story inside her head. For a brief moment, she felt relief, but only for a brief moment, because something unexpected happened. The fear remained. That realization disturbed her. If there was no evidence, why was she still afraid? The answer was simple. The fear had never depended on evidence. The fear existed first. The evidence came later. Or at least, the search for evidence did. Over the following days, Jessica became more aware of how often she was thinking about Ryan, how often she checked the clock, how often she replayed conversations, how often she imagined scenarios. The numbers shocked her. Sometimes she spent hours mentally analyzing events that lasted only seconds. A delayed response, a missed call, a short conversation, tiny moments. Yet they occupied enormous space inside her mind. One afternoon, sitting alone in her car after work, Jessica asked herself a question. What if I'm wrong? The question created silence, a rare silence. What if Ryan hadn't changed at all? What if nothing suspicious was happening? What if the problem wasn't outside her life, but inside her fear? For a moment, she considered the possibility. And for a moment, everything became quiet. But fear rarely surrenders easily. Within minutes, the questions returned. The uncertainty returned. The anxiety returned. And once again, the need for certainty took over. That was the moment the invisible line disappeared. The line between concern and obsession, between curiosity and surveillance, between protecting a relationship and damaging it. Jessica didn't realize it yet, but she was no longer trying to understand Ryan. She was trying to control uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the few things human beings can never fully control. The more she fought it, the stronger it became, and soon, she would make a decision that pushed her even deeper into the story she had created, a story that was beginning to feel more real than reality itself. Every obsession eventually reaches a moment of action. A moment when thinking is no longer enough. A moment when the mind demands certainty. For Jessica Miller, that moment arrived on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Ryan was preparing to leave for another project meeting. Nothing unusual, nothing different from dozens of other weekends. He grabbed his folder, picked up his keys, said goodbye, and left. Jessica stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the street. For a few seconds, she remained perfectly still. Then, something happened. Not outside, inside. A decision. Small, silent, almost invisible, but powerful enough to change everything. Without fully thinking about it, Jessica grabbed her own keys, started her car, and drove away. At first, she told herself she wasn't following Ryan. She was simply taking a drive, getting some fresh air, clearing her thoughts. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was looking for certainty, and certainty had become an obsession. The streets of Chicago were unusually busy that afternoon. Traffic lights, pedestrians, weekend crowds. Every delay felt frustrating. Every red light felt personal. Every minute felt important. Because when anxiety takes control, even ordinary obstacles begin to feel significant. After several minutes, Jessica spotted Ryan's vehicle, parked outside a restaurant. Her stomach tightened. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. And immediately, her imagination started working. Why here? Who was he meeting? Why hadn't he mentioned the restaurant? Why hadn't he explained more? The questions appeared instantly. Long before any answers existed, Jessica parked several buildings away, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to watch. Then she waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The waiting was unbearable, not because something was happening, because nothing was happening. And uncertainty has a way of making silence feel dangerous. Then finally, the restaurant door opened. Ryan stepped outside. Jessica's heart began pounding. And then she saw someone else. A woman, professional appearance, holding project documents, walking beside him, talking, smiling, listening. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, nothing secretive. Just two co-workers leaving a meeting. But Jessica wasn't watching reality anymore. She was watching her story. And her story immediately filled in the blanks. That smile meant something. That conversation meant something. That moment meant something. At least that's what fear told her. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. Once we become emotionally committed to a belief, the brain begins interpreting neutral information as confirmation. The evidence doesn't need to change. Only the interpretation changes. And interpretation can be incredibly persuasive. Ryan and the woman continued talking for a few moments. Then they walked toward separate vehicles, separate directions, separate destinations, an entirely ordinary ending. Yet Jessica barely noticed, because by then, her conclusion had already been formed. The facts no longer mattered. The story mattered. She drove home before Ryan returned. The entire drive felt surreal. Part of her felt justified. Part of her felt guilty. Part of her felt relieved. And part of her felt more afraid than ever. Because certainty had not brought peace. It had only created more questions. That evening, Ryan came home as usual. He smiled, asked about her day, talked about work, and Jessica realized something terrifying. For weeks, she had been searching for proof. But now, she wasn't sure what proof would even look like. Because the story inside her head had become stronger than the reality in front of her. And for the first time, she stopped asking herself what she believed and started asking what she should do next. That question would lead directly to the conversation both of them had been avoiding. The conversation that began with 4 simple words. Who is Emily? For weeks, Jessica had imagined this conversation, the confrontation, the explanation, The moment when everything would finally make sense. In her mind, she had replayed it hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. Every possible answer, every possible reaction, every possible outcome. But reality rarely follows the script we create inside our heads. That evening, after dinner, the silence felt heavier than usual. Ryan noticed it. He had been noticing it for weeks. The short answers, the distant behavior, the tension, the feeling that something was wrong. And finally, he asked the question, "Jessica, what's going on?" The room became quiet. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Jessica looked down, took a deep breath, and finally asked the question that had consumed her thoughts for months. "Who is Emily?" Ryan looked surprised, not defensive, not angry, surprised. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand the question. Then realization appeared on his face. "Emily? The project coordinator?" Jessica nodded. The silence returned. And then Ryan explained. Emily was exactly who he had always said she was. A coworker, a project coordinator, someone responsible for schedules and communication between departments. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no hidden relationship, no secret meetings, no double life, no betrayal, just work. Ordinary, unremarkable, normal. Jessica listened, and for the first time in months, she felt something unexpected. Not relief, embarrassment. Because, deep down, she already knew something important. The fear had started long before Emily ever appeared. Long before the project. Long before the late meetings. Long before the unanswered questions. The real battle was never between Jessica and Emily. The real battle was happening inside Jessica's own mind. And that is where Sarah Mitchell enters this story. Years later, behavioral analyst Sarah Mitchell reviewed the psychological patterns behind similar cases. What she found was fascinating. Many people believe jealousy is about another person, but often it isn't. It's about fear. Specifically, the fear of loss, the fear of abandonment, the fear that history might repeat itself. Sarah explained that when a person carries unresolved emotional wounds, their brain often becomes hypervigilant, always searching, always scanning, always preparing for danger, even when no danger exists. And once that process begins, ordinary events start looking suspicious. Neutral moments start feeling personal, and imagined stories start feeling true. Jessica wasn't reacting to Ryan. She was reacting to a childhood fear that had never fully healed. A fear that quietly followed her into adulthood, into her relationships, into her future, and eventually into this story. Looking back years later, Jessica described the experience as exhausting. Not because of Ryan, not because of Emily, because of the endless conversation happening inside her own head. The constant analysis, the constant uncertainty, the constant need for reassurance. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from this case. Sometimes the greatest threat to a relationship is not another person. Sometimes it is fear. Fear disguised as love. Fear disguised as protection. Fear disguised as certainty. And if we never question those fears, they can slowly reshape reality itself. Case file number 002. The day jealousy destroyed everything. Closed. But before we finish, I want to ask you one final question. Do you think Jessica's fear was understandable, or do you think she crossed the line long before she realized it? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind real human behavior, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because in our next case file, we'll examine something even more dangerous than jealousy. A man who spent years feeding a single thought, revenge, and how one idea slowly transformed his entire life. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next file.